I walked into the intensive care unit and screamed the word like it had been lodged in my chest for days. Murder. They say a hospital is a place for hushes and measured footsteps, for machines that whisper and doctors who speak in the language of probabilities. I know that. I worked my whole life in offices where numbers rule and signatures matter. But the corridor that night was hot with accusation. It felt like the fluorescent lights had sharpened into knives. Sterling's face was flushed, his jaw like a fist. He took a step toward the bed as if the ventilator was something you could pry away, a trophy you could steal. I held up the papers in my hand, deed, power of attorney drafts, a photocopy of a will I'd pulled from a locked box. And I said it again, quieter this time, to the room and to the man who was supposed to be her husband. You are not taking her from us. People later would argue semantics. They would ask whether I had the legal right to stand between a man and the woman he married. They would weigh love against neglect and ask in a dozen polite ways who had the authority when a body was so fragile it could be curled into a single breath. But in that corridor, with monitors hissing like a sea and the private security guard behind me like a bulkhead, I did what mothers are supposed to do. I protected the child in front of me, even if that child had been grown 20 years. That is where this starts, not with flights or papers, but with a single whispered sentence from Vada, the whisper I will carry until I am old enough to forget my own name. She opened her eyes, the lids trembling, and mouthed, small as a moth's beat, "Don't let him in." If you followed me here for these stories, you know I do not yell for attention. I do the quiet work, the paperwork, the phone calls that make people uncomfortable. I flew across 3 states, 2 days of thinking, and 1 impulsive decision that was more grit than planning. I arrived with a suitcase and 2 jars and a teddy bear. Those 2 jars sound like nothing, glass jars with cheap screw-top lids you can buy at any dollar store. One had nickels and dimes. The other had folded bills, the kind you shove into a place to remember later. The teddy was threadbare at its ear, the kind of thing you see in secondhand stores and think of as an emblem of love that has been used too much. I bought them because I had to bring something that would prove I was a mother who showed up. I had to bring something that said I knew how to care. And I had the papers. You will hear me say that again. Paper is what saved her life, or at least it gave me the legal leverage to build a lifeline. Paper and stubbornness. Not miracles, not drama. Paper. The trip there was a stitch of memory I repeat when I can't sleep. I left before dawn, a cab taking me to the airport with the city still blinking off. My heart was a regulator, steady and incessant. I imagined Vada in her apartment, the smell of stale smoke, pizza boxes still on the coffee table, pills half empty in their bottles like a testament to delayed apologies. I imagined Sterling's Escalade idling outside, with music too loud. I imagined Vada turning the key in the lock and finding the house cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. I found the apartment exactly like that. The hallway light buzzed. The doormat had a half-moon of dirt from whatever shoes they'd been tracking in. I knocked, and the door answered with a creak. Inside, the air was stale with tobacco and the faint metallic tang of old bottles. A magazine lay open to an article about celebrities you never met. The couch had an indentation where someone had slept. The kitchen sink held the ghosts of cups. But it was the bedroom that made my hand go clammy. There, on a nightstand under a lamp that burned like a dying moon, sat a pill bottle with dust chipped into the cap. I put my fingers to it and felt the grit. I found a second bottle behind a coffee tin, pills still clattered and their labels half hidden by grime. On the dresser, a jewelry box sat shut with a band of dust. On top of it, like a breadcrumb trail, was a little notebook, pocket-sized, stuffed with receipts and folded paper. I opened it and began to read. Vada's handwriting was small, a tilt of letters that betrayed haste and fear. The first entry said nothing dramatic. Wednesday. Stur said he'd pick up meds, but didn't. He left at midnight. Took keys. The next lines were sharper. Money missing from drawer. He says it's for bills. I don't see it. He came home smelling like whiskey. I told him I am sick. He laughed. We are taught to look for big things, broken glass, obvious cuts. But neglect is quieter. It sounds like pills untouched until they rattle into dust. It looks like an empty water glass on the nightstand and a phone with messages unread. It smells like smoke and the faint metallic tang of money spent in places where love must be sold for a night. There were receipts folded into the notebook, pawn shop slips, a medium-value ticket for something that had been bought in a moment of need and never brought back. The pawn ticket had Sterling's name on it, in a handwriting the clerk recognized. That was where irritation became evidence. I called Eudora. She is old-school law in a woman. When I say old school, I mean the kind of attorney who remembers when a signature was enough to stop a war. She answered her phone like she had predicted trouble. "Speak," she said. That was her entire greeting. I told her I needed help securing a woman in a hospital 3 states away. I told her I had receipts and a diary, and a car registered to my name I suspected Sterling was using like a private account. Eudora didn't ask for the whole story. She asked for the documents. By the time I reached the ER, she had me on hands like a captain. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and the small, sweet chemical of plastic where someone had been cleaned. Veda was under sheets like a swallowed child. Her hair was a dark cloud against the pillow. Her breathing sounded like the room's other machines, reassuring in design, fragile in practice. Dr. Dubois stood next to the bed with a chart like an island of fact. "You didn't come because you were curious, miss." He checked the name. "Odelia. You came because someone failed her care. Is that it?" He had the kind of voice doctors get when they've learned to make hard things soft for family. I told him about the apartment, the pills, the diary. I told him about the phone messages that were ignored and then erased. I told him what Veda had whispered. He read the notes, frowned, and spoke in the bluntness of diagnosis. Bilateral pneumonia, severe dehydration. She's in a medically induced coma to allow her lungs to rest. The ventilator is doing the breathing she can't do right now. He drew the words out as if a slow pronunciation would keep them from exploding. This is where the title of this story all but wrote itself in my head. He tried to pull the plug, not as an action yet, but as a tendency to let go, to not fight for care. The phrase sat in my throat, and for a minute there was a beautiful clarity. Against the background of every missed prescription and empty water glass, everything pointed to a decision. Neglect, I learned then, is less a single act than a pattern. 1 night without meds, 2 nights without water, a month of non-answers, and someone's life thins toward a hinge. I could see it in the slips of paper I held. I could see it in Sterling's swagger when he thought no one was watching. He had grown from a boy who stole quarters off the kitchen table to a man who gambled with credit and affection both. Did he mean to kill her? I couldn't say. But intent mattered less in the hospital corridor. What mattered was effect. Someone was not being cared for, and a ventilator had become the thing that might, for a while, keep her alive. I tell the truth plainly. I didn't plan a legal war. I planned to get who I could into a place where help would be paid for, and where the hands on the bed would be those that wanted to keep her. Eudora was the architect of my legal siege. With the diary and the pawn receipts, she began to build a case for exploitation, for financial abuse. We filed a report about the car. The SUV Sterling drove, eyesore of midnight blue and chrome, was registered in my name. Years earlier, when Sterling's life took a corner I couldn't watch from the porch, I had put title to the car in my name so I could help him without enabling. He had used it as if ownership never mattered. He had pawned items, siphoned cash, and called me when the engine died. I had given him rope and learned late and sharp that rope can be used to tie you to a pit. I called 911 that night and reported the vehicle as stolen. I told them I had reason to believe it had been used in ways not covered by my permission and that I wanted it detained. That call sounds dramatic when you say it now, but at the time it was a measured move. There were rules to be followed. The police were terse and bureaucratic, and in their way, kind. "We can run the plates, ma'am. We can see who is driving. We'll detain if appropriate." 2 hours later, Officer Bradshaw called me. They had Sterling in custody at the precinct. He'd been stopped for reckless driving. They found the car with him. They questioned him. He swore, promised, and then was let go on a technicality. But the car was impounded. That gave us leverage. Leverage is a strange word for people who think law is cold. Leverage is not vengeance. It is a tool you use when the other party has been wielding your kindness like currency. I told Eudora to prepare a deed of gift, transferring title of the car to Vada. Why Vada? Because the funds from selling the vehicle had to have a legal place to go for her care. Because I did not trust Sterling to spend one more dime on neon lights and nights that lasted only until dawn. Because the hospital bills were not an abstract. They were the very thing between her ribs and the future. Odora laughed when I told her I wanted the deed ready, as if she liked that I had finally become sharp enough to fight. "You can't gift what's not entirely yours," she said, "but you can make a strong case if the paperwork is clean and the registration supports it." We drafted the deed, I signed what I could, and we set the wheels in motion. The plan felt like a map drawn with a steady hand. Sell the car, fund the care, secure the apartment, lock him out. In the meantime, I took to the hospital like a general taking stock of her troop. I sat in uncomfortable chairs so nurses would talk. I learned hospital rhythms, medication rounds, visitor windows, the way a nurse's laughter can be the only sound in a night shift that keeps your mind from sprinting. I memorized Dr. Dubois' warnings and the lists of possible complications. I learned what medically induced coma meant, a chemical pause in consciousness so the lungs could rest and fight the infection. I learned that a ventilator is not a permanent answer. It is a bridge. Someone has to tend that bridge. Sterling came and went like weather. He arrived once wearing an expression like a man who'd been cut by life, but couldn't stop himself from continuing to take. He leaned over the bed and said things to her more like commands than confessions. "Come on, baby, squeeze my hand. You're my wife." He had the audacity of someone who saw loyalty as a retainer rather than a covenant. He touched the machines as if their humming offended him, as if their noise was the bureaucracy of love, when love, in his mind, meant pleasure unaccounted for and debts paid by other people's benevolence. The day he tried to get past the guard, I was ready. I had Odora's phone call woven into my coat pocket and the photocopies of the diary folded like a small weapon in my purse. The private security guard, a woman named Cindy, with tattoos on her knuckles and a voice that did not negotiate, stationed herself in the doorway. "He doesn't have visiting rights beyond this point without authorization," she said, "and not tonight." Sterling shoved past her on the second attempt. He smelled of the bar downtown. He moved his hands like a man unaccustomed to being told no. I moved like a woman whose child is in the bed. I stepped between him and the machine and showed the photocopy of the will I had tucked inside the diary folder. Not everyone understands the theatrical part of evidence. Sometimes you hold a paper up and it draws light like a signal. The monitor flashed. Veda's chest rose, not quite a breath, but enough for the room to remember there was a person in there. "You're not allowed here," I said, plain as daylight. "You have no legal standing to make decisions while she's incapacitated." Sterling's laugh was strangled. "You think you can come here and what, play mother? You don't know the first thing." The word murder left my mouth like a verdict, not because I believed he had physically yanked wires. No camera had caught that. No doctor would later testify to it. But because neglect is its own kind of killing. Because when someone hoards affection and money in the same fist and lets a partner wither, the result is the same as a violent act. It is the slow shutdown of care. And when a man stands by as the medicine goes unbought, when he takes the money and spends it on nights that do not include the woman beside him, I will call it what it is. That night, nurses clustered, some with the polite horror of professionals used to pain, others with a hardness that comes from seeing similar stories repeat. A hospital social worker took my number. "We can only do so much until legal guardianship is assigned," she said, "but the documentation helps." I do not like to shout. I prefer a plan that moves like a chess piece. But words are tools too, and there are times a good, sharp word will open doors where velvet cannot. "I am the heir," I announced, because the title needed an early crown. Some heard literal claim. Others heard the moral claim. I am the one taking responsibility. I explained I had evidence of financial abuse. I had receipts of pawnbroker sales, diary entries that read like logs of being forgotten, and a photocopy of a forged-looking power of attorney that bore Veda's signature in a way that didn't look like the handwriting I had come to know. I showed them the deed in progress. I put everything on the table like a set of cards. "Please," Veda mouthed that afternoon, the V of her lips barely moving, and Cindy, the guard, leaned in and whispered back, "We won't let him near the room." The hospital administrator promised to review the visitation logs and the legal documents. The police, Officer Bradshaw, was patient in his own way, thorough until fatigue crept into the edges of his voice. He said, "We can hold it as evidence of a possible exploitation." He did not promise arrests. His job was not made of promises. But he took the notes and fed them into a system that works in tiny movements. What followed were days of small victories and tedious paperwork. Odora worked with registrars and the county clerk's office. She taught me how to watch for the exact language that would make a deed legitimate. She taught me to leave room for challenge and yet to be firm. She showed me the anatomy of a will and how often wills are written in heat and forgotten in drawers. How often, tragically, they're all someone needs to change a life. We sold the car. That sentence is easier to say than it was to accomplish. The tow trucks took the Escalade to the lot, its chrome glinting in the sun like nothing had happened. The manager at the impound yard was looking for paper trail. I handed him the deed, the registration, and the notarized transfer Eudora had prepared. In 3 signatures, the money from that sale became a fund for Veda's care. It was legal, deliberate, and necessary. The hospital set up a separate account where the funds were directed. No surprises at bill time. No chance of Sterling siphoning them off for another dice game or another night at the club. Once you begin to move the legal pieces, people reveal their true faces. Sterling's fell like flaking paint. He was angry in a way that tasted like shame. He'd been a boy once who broke a neighbor's window and learned to apologize with chores. He became a man who broke promises and learned to apologize with promises he never intended to keep. The change that comes with a man who loses his illusions is not pretty. He is reduced to pleading and to threats that read like rusted tools, loud at first, then useless. I have not always been hard on my children. There were seasons of indulgence because grief made my hands loose and because I thought love could plug the hole Sterling made for himself. But there is a line where love becomes enabling, and you must step over it or watch another person fall through. I could not watch Veda fall anymore, so I chose legal containment. I chose the cold efficiency that papers bring. People asked me afterward if I felt guilty about what I did to my son. You will not be surprised by the nature of my answer. Guilt is a flavor of empathy. It means you have a conscience that attends to consequences. But guilt is not the same as ceding responsibility. I am a mother who values fairness, but not at the cost of a life. There is a difference between hard love and cruelty. You can draw it like a line across the kitchen table. Sterling's first arrest, brief, procedural, did not erase the years of slippage. He was released with a warning, and that is when the most dangerous part of all this began. He knew he could get loose. He believed privilege still had a cushion. That was part of his arrogance. We set the security. We got the hospital to log visitors strictly. We changed locks at the apartment and removed his key from the registry. We filed a notice with the county that made his re-entry a matter of legal consequence. There were nights I didn't sleep. I made coffee that tasted like remorse and sat in a chair by the window until dawn sifted through the blinds. Veda's breaths were the rhythm of my life then, the thing I kept in a jar the way a child keeps pennies. I read her diary aloud to myself sometimes, not to dramatize her suffering, but to understand it, to translate notation into narrative. She had written, in a page folded and smudged, "I am tired of asking." That line, "I am tired of asking," was the kind of heartbreak that takes you to the mailbox to find a check and then opens it to see it's made out to someone else. I will tell you now, even as I was doing these things, the lines were not clean. I spent time on the phone with people who wanted to tell me that there were 2 sides to every story. I listened. Sterling had his own set of fractures, losses and holes no one had patched. There were times when I saw the boy inside the adult, the one who still needed a hand to steady him more than a fist to punish him. But seeing a man in pain does not mean you allow him to make someone else's life the price of his relief. The hospital became a theater of small routines. Night nurses would shift, exchanging notes about the best way to keep Veda's skin from drying, about the way her pupils reacted to light, about the subtle shock that comes when someone begins to turn the corner. Dr. Dubois was precise. Once when I asked him if there was hope, he said, "Hope is a measured thing. We have treatment. The lungs are battling. If we can keep infections controlled and nutrition supported, her body may respond." He did not promise miraculous awakenings. He offered probabilities, and that was enough for me. I learned during those long days the value of boring paperwork, a registered deed, a notarized signature, an impound report. These are the scaffolds of protection. They are what keep a guardian from being a pretender. When a social worker came to my chair and said, "If you want to pursue guardianship, you'll have to file in family court," I felt the sick crease of bureaucracy. Eudora handled that formality like a woman who likes the snap of a stamp. She walked me through the petition, the affidavits, the way a judge will always ask for reason, not passion. You will hear people say later that I became cold, that I used the law to bruise my son. What I used it for was to buy time. Time for medicine, time for nurses who could attend without being obstructed, time for Veda's lungs to fight their battle with the steady rhythm of a machine that was not mercy, but mechanism. The day I nearly lost my patience, when the SUV's impound lot called and said Sterling had tried to pay them off with a card with money he didn't have, when his voice on the phone said, "I'll take care of her, Ma." I packed the 2 jars and the teddy into my bag and walked back into that corridor. There was a security guard at the door, and a nurse who had the tired look of someone who had seen too much human drama and had learned to hold it at bay. Sterling shoved once more, and his hand brushed the edge of the monitor. Cindy, the guard, stepped between us and put a gentle but immovable hand on his shoulder. "We're done here tonight," she said. "You can talk in the lobby." He leaned close to me then, his breath a mix of cologne and desperation. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, and the heat of his plea was almost enough to melt me back into being a mother who wanted to fix all things. But Vada's eyes were closed, her chest riding the ventilator's rhythm. She was not asking permission to be protected. She was asking for someone to keep the bad ones away. "You made your choices," I said. So did she. I do not enjoy the sound of my own finalities, but there are moments when you must speak them. The deed was executed the next day. The funds from the sale of the car were transferred into an account the hospital could access by submitting the proper forms. We registered the transfer with the county so it couldn't be reversed by a casual signature. We had the bank name the hospital and Vada as beneficiaries for the treatment account, so nothing could be siphoned off by a man with a habit and a grudge. We filed a police report on the possible forgery and took a photocopy of the suspected forged power of attorney to their office. And yet, none of it made the pain go away. I would sit beside that bed and think about the woman who had to learn to ask for water. I would read entries from her diary where she wrote not of big tragedies but small betrayals. He didn't come back from the store. I called. He said he fell asleep. I would imagine the nights she swallowed pills without anyone checking, and the mornings she woke with a mouth like sawdust and no one offering a glass. This is the part people do not prepare you for, the way the world will try to convince you that love and neglect are the same, the way they will dress up indifference as a muted temperament and call it a personality. I refused to accept that. I came there to hold a person whose voice had been sidetracked by another's appetites. I came to wrestle the inertia of neglect into the design of care. I came to hold paperwork like a torch. The night the security guard finally refused Sterling entry entirely, he stood in the hallway like a man who had been stripped of his props. He used his voice as a battering ram, and for a few terrible minutes he sounded almost like a man who had been wronged and thought the world behind him owed him restitution. "You're stealing my wife," he yelled, and the accusation hung in the air like a word someone flings when they have nothing else. "Not stealing," I said, "protecting." He tried to walk past, and Cindy stepped in and put a palm against his chest. "No," she said, "you can go to a visitation area and speak to social work, but not here." It escalated. Small blows, loud feelings, a push towards the dramatic. He planted himself on the floor outside the room like a protest, folding his arms and refusing to move. Security called the police. Officer Bradshaw arrived with a report and the patient air of someone who knew his job. Sterling was warned again. The hospital prepared a paper to be sent to family court should guardianship be needed. And then, as if the universe wanted to measure the thinness of my confidence, Vada's lips parted, and the faintest smile curled there. It was not a smile of romance. It was the memory of a life that still had pleasures. Sunlight through a kitchen window, the sound of a street vendor's laugh, the smell of coffee and cinnamon. She coughed, and a nurse leaned in with a suction, and the machine hiccuped and settled. That small movement, breath, cough, a hint of a smile, was the thing that kept the fight honest. It was the reminder that the person in that bed was a life, not an argument. It is the same feeling that kept me from doing anything reckless. I never once cut corners. I never once promised you that deeds solve everything. They don't. They buy time. They open doors. Then it's the slow, patient care that will, sometimes, make the difference. There are people who will ask later, who was the villain in all this? I have to tell you, it is a complicated portrait. Sterling had a string of bad impulses. He had a temperament kinked by gambling and bad choices. He had debts that looked like mountains when you are small, and pockets that look like caves when you are empty. There is a portion of responsibility he possessed, and a portion of responsibility he refused. Vada had a courage in the corners where she thought she didn't deserve it. I had the stubbornness to turn the law toward protection. We were only starting. The deed had been filed. The car sale had funded the immediate treatment. The police had a copy of the diary and the pawn receipts. Eudora had prepared a petition for guardianship that would have to be reviewed in family court. Sterling had been warned by the police more than once.
Vada lay between us like a fragile bridge. And as I stood there in the corridor, holding the papers that felt heavier than iron, I felt the world narrow to a single line of decision. Would I protect this life, even if it meant pushing my son into a hard reckoning? Would I be the kind of mother who lets anything be excused for the sake of comfort? That night, I chose protection. There is much more to this, and I will tell you how the rest unfolded, but not yet.
For now, know this. What looks like cruelty from a distance can be the only thing that saves a life up close. What looks like law can be the last act of mercy. And what looks like a scream in a corridor can be the voice of a woman who will not let neglect be dressed up as fate. If this is the kind of story you want more of, raw places where love and law collide, subscribe and stay with me. There are parts of this you are going to want to hear. The forged signature, the pawn tickets that read like betrayals, the night Veda whispered again, and the security camera lens blinked like an eye that keeps secrets. There are arguments I will have with judges, and conversations I will have with people who told me I should have done things different. But first, I have to go back to the bed. When I return that evening, Sterling is sitting on a bench in the lobby like a man who has been frightened straight, but not by remorse. He watches every door as if that's where his life has been boxed. He mutters into his phone and flings glances my way. I walk past him with the diary in my purse and the papers in my hand. I do not gloat. I do not lecture. I only say what I have to. You won't be let to make decisions while she is incapacitated. We have legal instruments. We will contest anything illegal. Do you understand that? He looks up as if the world had handed him a card he did not want, then says in a voice rough as gravel, "You think I'm trying to kill her?" The question is not rhetorical. He really wants me to answer. I could have thrown accusations, said what I felt, but I answered in the only way that matters, with evidence. "I think you neglected her," I said, "and that is why we are here." He laughed then, a brittle sound, and said, "This is family business. You can't come in here and steal our problems." That was when the guard stepped forward and muttered something to him about trespass. He pushed back, a small, useless shove, and the man who once thought himself invincible found himself wandering the sidewalk outside like someone who had been rendered invisible. The hospital doors side closed behind him. Inside, Veda's fingers twitched once. It was small and almost secret. I took that as an answer from a life that still wanted to be lived. I sat down in the chair and let my head rest back. I did not know what law would say in 2 weeks, nor did I know whether the family court would grant me the guardianship I sought. I only knew what the diary, the receipts, and the dust on those pill bottles had told me. Neglect had been allowed, and someone in a hospital bed needed advocacy more than she needed explanations. The papers, photocopies of alleged forgeries, the notebook, the pawn receipts, sat in a folder like the bones of a small, quiet war. I had prepared them, printed them, labeled them. Odora had taught me to number exhibits as if we were rehearsing for a performance. We were not rehearsing. We were preparing for the possible need to make truth behave like a piece of evidence. That night, as the machines hummed, I pressed the teddy bear to my chest. It smelled faintly of lavender from someone else's home. The jars of coins looked like nothing at all on the nightstand. They were meager and honest things often do the work. Outside, Sterling's car sat impounded, glinting under a street lamp. That chrome would be sold. The money would go into care. He would not like it. He would call names. He would threaten to expose things. People will be what they are. My job was to make sure their actions did not decide a life. I went home briefly that night, a room above a storefront with thin curtains, and I thought about the boy Sterling had been. I thought about how sometimes children become adults by repeating the shapes of their parents' failures. I thought about how I had tried to teach him responsibility and where I had failed. Regret is a teacher who offers no certainties. In the morning, we would return. There would be more phone calls, more paperwork, a social worker signature, a bank transfer. There would be another reading of the diary, and perhaps the first hearing to determine temporary guardianship. There would be questions about faith and forgiveness. There would be Sterling standing outside the courthouse, his face the color of someone whose safety net had been taken away. But that is the trouble with beginnings. They make you do things you never thought you would. They also make you find the parts of yourself that have been waiting for a crisis to prove their worth. I had found mine, a willingness to lean on law and a refusal to let neglect masquerade as forgiveness.
So I sit now in a hospital chair, the papers folded in my lap, and wait for Veda to wake. I wait for the judge to hear our petition. I wait for the world to decide whether a mother's intervention is heroic or humiliating. I wait for Sterling to decide whether to change or to fall. And in the quiet, I remember the line in her diary that shattered me the first time I read it. I am tired of asking. I will not let her be tired of asking anymore. The rest of this story will tell you how the law moved, how the evidence held up, and what it cost us all. But for now, in the corridor where I once screamed, "Murder," and lifted papers up like a banner, I breathe and I wait for the machines to tell me what comes next. Morning came like a cautious animal, hesitant and soft. I woke to the fluorescent hum already in the room, the machines keeping the kind of company only people who live beside illness learn to keep. The folder in my lap felt heavier than paper deserved. I unfolded another photocopy, smoothed it between my palms, as if that could iron the edges of what had happened. Diary entries, the pawn receipt with Sterling's name scrawled on the back, the photocopy of a suspect power of attorney that bent at the signature like a bad imitation.
Eudora arrived before the clerk's office opened. She moved through the hospital like a woman who had long ago learned that institutions respond to persistence more than petition. She had her purse, a thick legal pad, and a look you get when you intend to do damage to a flawed system, in the best possible way. We did not speak much as she sat and made lists in ballpoint ink, the sound of her pen the sort of metronome that calms nerves. "We file for temporary guardianship," she said, looking up only long enough to make the decision official. "We present evidence of exploitation and medical incapacity. We ask for the right to make medical and financial decisions until the court hears the case. We bring the police report about the suspected forgery. We bring the impound report. We bring a petition for an emergency hearing. And, this is key, we bring the testimony of any medical professional who will speak plainly about the risk if someone unfit is allowed unsupervised access." The list read like an inventory of war. It felt, in those moments, like the only language the courthouse would understand. We began the assembly. Eudora took copies of everything and wrote exhibit numbers on the corners with a neat, clinical hand. I called Officer Bradshaw and asked whether he could come down to give a statement in person. He promised and arrived with that private gravity policemen learn when they have to be both shield and paper. He sat across from us and said he could testify to the impound, to the traffic stop, to the fact Sterling had been stopped for reckless driving while operating the vehicle registered to me. He could not, he said, testify to intent to harm Veda. He could only speak to what he had seen. That was enough. We asked Dr. Dubois for a written statement. He was careful with his words, the kind of care a doctor uses when he must balance facts and compassion. He wrote that Veda's condition, bilateral pneumonia and severe dehydration, made her fragile and that her care required consistent medication administration and hydration. He added that any interference with the ventilator or the medical plan would pose a risk. He did not use dramatic phrases. He did not need to. The paper did its work. Eudora leaned back and said, "We need more than medicine. We need a clear and present danger that a person with access will remove care or obstruct it." I looked at the folder and felt the little hot prickle of anger that comes when something ordinary, like paying a bill, has been allowed to become the difference between life and death. We had to make the ordinary urgent. It occurred to me then to ask about the security cameras. Hospitals run them like a nervous eye. They record corridors, entrances, sometimes the peripheries of rooms. I asked the nurse at the desk, a woman with soft hair pulled into a clip and an expression that threaded kindness through fatigue, whether the hospital archived any footage from the night Sterling had been aggressive in the hall.
Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. The hospital was careful with footage, careful about privacy and procedure, but she told me they kept camera logs for security incidents and that an incident report had indeed been taken. When the security office called us back, the man who answered with a clipped voice said they could pull footage from the hallway cameras. It took a little coaxing and 1,000 forms. Eudora has a way of filling paperwork that makes administrators feel as if they were aiding a patriot's cause. 2 days later, with a subpoena Eudora arranged through a quick judge's order for an emergency hearing, we sat in a small, quiet room and watched a grainy strip of footage. The camera did not show everything, no detailed close-up of hands on a ventilator, nothing cinematic or fit for a courtroom drama. What it did show was Sterling pacing in front of the room, his shoulders tight, and then leaning toward the bed. A nurse stepped into the frame and spoke to him, a gentle, professional motion of words and hands. Sterling turned and, in the grainy flicker of a camera, reached toward the jurisdiction of the nurse's station, toward the general control area. He did not pull any plug that we could see. He did not on the tape perform the final move that would make a headline. What the footage did capture, however, was the attempt to get past staff into an area where he had no business. We played that grainy strip in court. The judge watched with the patience of someone who has seen human behavior in its many guises. Sterling's lawyer argued the footage was inconclusive. Eudora leaned forward and made the point I had been trying to say in 1,000 different ways, that custody and access in medical situations are not about one strike, but about patterns. The tape was context. The diary and the receipts were context. The impound and the police report were context. Taken together, they were a story that a judge could not politely dismiss. The hearing itself was small, more officious than dramatic. The family court judge was a woman with a kind face and an iron core. She listened to Dr. Dubois read clinical statements into the record, watched Officer Bradshaw repeat what he had seen on the traffic stop report, and took Eudora's exhibit list. Sterling stood at the table with a public defender who had the professional wariness of people who believe in second chances until those chances wear thin. Sterling looked smaller in that room than he had in the hospital corridor. His jaw had the familiar tension of defense. I watched him and found my hands trembling and quieting simultaneously. "You are asking for temporary guardianship of Miss Veda," the judge said, her voice precise. "You ask that patient care decisions and financial decisions be directed to Miss Oilia during the pendency of this case?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eudora said.
She explained our chain of evidence, the impound, the suspected forgery, the diary entries describing unfilled prescriptions and missed returns, and the security footage suggesting Sterling had tried to access regulated areas. She requested an order for temporary guardianship so that hospital and bank could work with a single, accountable person who had the court's imprimatur. Sterling's lawyer argued access, family rights, and the presumption of innocence. He raised the specter of overreach, of a mother who would strip a son of his relationship based on emotion. Sterling himself stood up when asked to speak and said, in a voice that tried for reason and got only a thinness I recognized, "I don't want anything to happen to her. I'm her husband." "Then prove that," Eudora had said earlier when I emptied my heart at her kitchen table. She did not say this in court. She said it to me when all legalities were not yet a thing, but only a possibility. The judge considered it all like a seamstress considering whether a tear could be temporarily tacked shut. In the end, she issued a temporary order granting me emergency guardianship, limited to medical decision-making and to the immediate financial decisions necessary for Veda's care. It was not a permanent decree. It would not erase the possibility of later hearing or longer litigation, but it was a shield, and in that courthouse that day, shields are often the difference between stalled oil and moving water. When the clerk read the order aloud, I felt a release that was not purely joy. It was the sober relief of a person who has found a way to keep breathing in a room that had been losing hair. Sterling's face was a map of several emotions: defiance, confusion, sudden emptiness. He muttered something that could have been a vow or an accusation. He left the courtroom like a man exiting a stage while an audience sorts which line was his. We changed the locks on the apartment that week. Eudora sat in the county clerk's office and made a phone call to the registry and told them the property needed an updated signatory list. That particular bureaucracy takes time, and time in these cases is a currency you spend fast. We did the fastest legal thing we could do without trampling law. We filed a notice of corrective transfer, and for record. We had the locksmith install a new deadbolt, and the landlord signed an addendum to the lease that removed Sterling's rights to a key. We did it all in the existing framework the law affords an owner who is present and making decisions. No trespass, no theft. Just paperwork moving like a small dam shutting off a dangerous flow. Sterling didn't take that passively. There's a stubbornness and entitlement that expects the world to reset when you ask. He punched a wall once, left a dent, and called names in a voice so loud the neighbors could hear. People heard the scrape of his public humiliation, like an abrasive cloth over a polished piece. But the legal moves had that particular humiliating clarity. He could yell and he could threaten, but he could not legally access the funds that were now being managed for Vada's care. That management did not mean I was the autocrat of her life. I called a meeting with the hospital social worker, and we set up a hospital trust account for Vada. The funds from the Escalade sale went there, ring-fenced for treatment, physical therapy, and if needed, rehab. The account required 2 people to authorize discretionary expenses for transparency, a hospital administrator and myself. No single person could siphon off the funds. That layer of small bureaucracy kept greed far away. The days slid into a rhythm of small victories. Vada's fevers eased, antibiotics sank into the infection and began to push it out. Dr. Dubois' reports showed slow but steady improvement, fewer secretions, better oxygenation numbers, a sputum culture turning less hostile. The machine adjustments grew less aggressive. Nurses charted intake and output with clinical tenderness. The first time a nurse recorded that Vada had taken a sip of water without coughing, I cried in the supply closet like a foolish person who had been starving for a small, human miracle. Sterling tried to appeal.
He called my voicemail and left messages that veered between pleading and accusation. "Ma," he said in one that still sits in my phone like a fossil, "you don't have to take everything from me. I'm trying." He tried to apologize in the next and threaten in the next. I didn't return most of the calls. A boundary is a small action. It is a refusal to run to a child who has a habit of burning his hands and then asking you to put them in yours again. The hospital offered counseling for Vada's family. I went sometimes, and sometimes I did not. The sessions were a place where the emotional calculus of our lives was made visible. Sterling attended once and left early. He told the counselor he felt misunderstood. He said, "I work, I pay, I tried." The counselor said nothing of the ledger because the ledger was not their immediate job. Their job was to untangle grief and shame and make them speakable. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into the guardianship, a nurse came into the room and said quietly, "She's waking." Dr. Dubois was called. Machines stood like sentries. I sat in the chair and felt my hands want to be elbows on a child's threshold, and also a captain steadying the ship. Vada's eyes opened and scanned the ceiling like someone trying to read a familiar ceiling fan and not finding it. Her first words were not coherent. They were a thin thread of syllables that might be recognized as her voice. She mouthed my name first, and the sound of it was a small bell. "Ma?" she tried, and then with a vagueness that was both tragic and beautiful. "Where? Why?" Her gaze landed on Sterling's empty chair in the visitor's log chart, and then on me. She squinted as the recognition rearranged itself.
"It's Olelia," I said. "I'm here." She blinked, and the tired machinings of the hospital room, gowns, monitors, the smell of disinfectant, started to gather context. It takes a while for a body to remember life outside the pause. Her speech came slowly, like water cut through ice. She had the first thin indignation of someone who had been made to wait. "Don't let him in," she whispered, with an honesty that knocked me sideways. The phrase was a small axe, blunt and perfect. I told Dr. Dubois about her verbalization. He smiled, a tired little upturn, and said that early speech is a good prognostic sign. He cautioned every measure: speech therapy, occupational therapy, nutrition follow-ups. He told us there would be hard days. He told us none of the cures would be instantaneous. He gave us the calendar of appointments and the names of the therapists who would measure her step by step. When Sterling heard she had woken and had spoken the words I had carried like prayer, he tried to thrust his way back into the room. He claimed the right of a husband to be present. The private guard Cindy stood firm. "Visitation will be supervised," she said, and the words were the same steady stone they had been when Sterling first pushed past. He wept then, not with the soft sob of an adult coming to grips, but with the brittle anger of a man who found two routes closed to him at once, a locked door and a court order. There was a hearing a month later for more extended guardianship and for a review of the finances. Odora recommended we present the judge with a small, extraordinary piece of evidence that changed the tenor of that hearing. A handwritten note we found among Veda's personal things, a short, sober paragraph that read, in her slanted script, "If I cannot speak, I want Olelia to handle my care. I trust her." The note was not a formal will. It was not executed with witnesses and witnesses' seals. But it was not meaningless either. In the court of human intent, a clear, contemporaneous statement by the patient is powerful. Odora asked the judge to consider it not as a magic wand, but as corroboration of the trust that Veda felt in me. Sterling's lawyer tried to argue that a quick note could not stand against marital rights. The judge listened and threaded the law around the compassion of what had been written. She granted me conservatorship for Veda's care for a 6-month period to allow medical rehabilitation and for a hearing to determine longer-term arrangements if needed. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe without checking a clock. The legal victory did not erase private entropy. Sterling's fall accelerated in the small humiliations no one captures in footage. Phone call after phone call that went unanswered. Friends who stopped answering his texts. Collectors who grew less polite. He tried briefly to sell odds in a half-legal scheme, and when that failed, he worked a stint at a car wash for a friend of a cousin.
I saw him once, months later, under a sun hat and an apron, scrubbing chrome with the determined slowness of a man learning to be useful. He looked small and ridiculous, and I felt for him in the way a parent feels for a child who has scraped knees and needs to be taught how to get up. Veda's recovery was not cinematic. It was the slow curation of small things, learning to hold a fork steadily, a speech therapist practicing vowel trains like an actor stuck repeating a line until it becomes a muscle. She learned to walk again with assistance, to navigate the slight dizziness that comes from lungs relearning to draw their full breath. I watched her rebuild a taste for life in small increments, a grilled cheese that did not make her cough, a newspaper read aloud, the first laugh that reached her eyes properly and not only as a reflex. She kept writing in the diary, but its lines changed. Where before were small notes cataloging neglect, now there were entries about progress and small pleasures. Tuesday, Miss Hannah at the shelter brought pastries, she wrote one morning. Another day, library training today. It was quiet and the smell of books made me cry. I liked it. The library was something she asked to try when she was medically stable enough for part-time hours. It matched the soft steadiness that sits inside her like a core, the kind of place where small, focused tasks are honored. It was not a grand comeback, it was a resettling. Her first paid day at the library was unremarkable, and therefore perfect. She shelved paperbacks with the motion of someone discovering a profession in a hand. She stamped cards with a slow, ceremonious care. She learned the layout in the way that quiet people learn maps, by walking them. The job did not fix everything. It did, though, reintroduce routine. Routine is the building block of trust in the world. Sterling watched from the edges, sometimes calling with offers to take her to lunch, sometimes with apologies that smelled like an attempt to purchase kindness. He offered to pay back the money from the car sale in small sums. He asked me, in a voice that had grown hollow and small, whether forgiveness could be a transaction. "If I do what you ask, will you let me be near her?" he pleaded on one call that breathed with desperation. I said what I have to say to sons who wish to be absolved by the presence of another person. Rebuilding trust is not a bargain you can cash in with an apology. It's the work you do to show you are different. You do it consistently. He started a program for men with addiction and gambling issues. He lasted longer there than I expected. The first weeks were a thin candle of effort. The first 3 months, a small, steady flame. He worked at the car wash. He took shifts in a kitchen. He sat on plastic chairs and listened to men tell stories about falling and trying to climb. I am human enough to admit that seeing him humiliate himself in the service of change made me less austere toward him. There is a part of a mother that never wants to see a child freeze in shame. But I was also wise enough to see that his accountability needed to be built into a timetable, and that his access to Vada had to be earned. There were moments that cut me, the way he would hover near the library door and then walk away. He would send hand-drawn flowers and cards, and occasionally a note asking if there was anything he could do. Vada, with a patience she had honed in medicine and therapy, would say small replies that were civility without comfort. "I appreciate you asking," she would say. And that line, "I appreciate you asking," is how you teach someone that possibility exists, but it is not a license to stroll back into privilege. People asked me if I felt like a thief for taking custody from my son. I always answer with the same clarity. Taking custody was not a theft. It was intervention. Theft requires intent to steal value for oneself. Guardianship, in this case, was a tool to ensure a person got the medicine and therapy she needed. The law agreed, temporarily. The rest, the moral accounting, was for each of us to manage. There were quieter legal pushes after that. Paperwork to shift bank beneficiaries, until Vada could do it herself. Forms to file for short-term disability that would allow her to get training at the library. A small trust to hold emergency funds. Odora, with her tea-stained mug and her habit of whistling under her breath when it was late, made sure the legal scaffolding did not buckle under the strain of human error. We built in check-ins. We kept receipts. We preserved transparency. Months later, on a late summer afternoon, Sterling showed up at the library with a bouquet of peonies that looked like they'd been bought with the dignity of someone on a tight budget. He stood at the entrance and watched Vada shelf books like a woman reclaiming a life. He waited until she had a moment and then approached, slow and practiced. He handed her the flowers like someone giving an offering at an altar. Vada accepted them with a small, careful nod. "Thank you," she said. There was none of the old velvet in her tone. There was calm. She had developed that air that says, without malice, that you cannot be given back what you have not earned. Afterwards, outside the library, Sterling and I talked for the longest time we had not spoken. He said small, true things. He told me about the embarrassment of taking a bus to a second-shift job, the shame of having to ask a cousin for a place to sleep, the first night he did not drink. He told me about the group that had kept him in his seat when he wanted to walk out. "It's been humbling," he said. And humbling in human lives often translates into the only lesson worth learning, that comfort cannot be the axis of a life. I told him, stern and tired, that he had to prove not only that he had changed,
but that he had learned to put another's needs before his own impulses. If you want a sovereign place back in Vada's life, I told him, it will be because you can show it steadily. Not promises, proof. He nodded, and that was the modest beginning of a new ledger. Vada's recovery became a tapestry of small stitches. She went from part-time at the library to training volunteers, to a small circle of friends who called to check on her and bring soup. She reconnected with the cousins who had been a safety net for her before Sterling had become the center of their association. She started to volunteer at a community reading program for kids, where her quiet voice and patient hands made her a natural. She found her voice again, the one that had been muffled by neglect and silence. We came to a crossroads that would test both mercy and justice. A county investigator called months after the first filings to say the district attorney's office might bring charges for financial exploitation based on the diary, the pawn receipts, and the suspicious POA photocopy. The DA wanted evidence of intent that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. This is where law and morality diverge. You can feel a man's guilt in your bones, but the state requires a stricter measurement. We provided everything we had. The evidence was persuasive, but prosecution requires more than persuasive. It requires proof. I left those decisions to the professionals and focused on what I could control, Vada's life. In quiet hours, I sometimes thought about the difference between being an heir and being a mother. The title of heir is usually a badge of inheritance, land, money, property. The title I took was a different one, heir of care, steward of resurrection. At the moment I first screamed murder in that corridor, I was asserting a right that is older than paperwork, the right to protect another human when they cannot protect themselves. That did not make me a hero. It made me a person who had learned that law could be used as a first aid kit, and that love, when it is complicit in harm, must be disentangled. I don't tell you this so that you will applaud me. There are things I wish I had done earlier, boundaries set when Sterling was a boy, harder conversations that might have prevented this cascade. There are regrets that will always belong to me, but regrets are private furniture we must sit with and then move on from. What I want you to take from this is a practical question. When does your love stop being helpful and start being a hand that ties someone to their worst instincts? The line is private, and it is public, and it is messy. There are also the small moments of grace that remind me why it was worth it. One morning, I walked into the library, and Vada, who'd once asked for water and been ignored, was reading aloud to a row of children with that perfect cadence she discovered in recovery.
The children sat rapt. She closed the book and exhaled, and when she came to me, she hugged me with a Spartan, warm hug that said more than any legal document. "Thank you," she whispered. She meant it for 1,000 small things. The money, the meals, the phone calls, the way I stood at the periphery and did not let the vultures near. Sterling, months later, called to tell me he had completed 30 days of a residential program and had saved a little money. He asked if he could take Veda out for coffee, on probation, with the librarian on call, and with me present. He was practicing permissions, and I accepted the permission he had earned. They sat at the cafe across the street and sipped drinks that cost too much for both of them, and were perfect because the steam rose in front of their faces like a small confettied flag. There was a night, long after the impound and the courtroom and the hearings, when Sterling and I sat on my back porch and watched the river take its slow, indifferent course. He said, as if he were testing himself aloud, "Do you think I could ever be forgiven?" I said what I had to say then and what I believe now. Forgiveness is not a destination someone else hands you. It's a practice you perform with the person you've wronged. It requires work, time, and consistency. You can be forgiven, son, but you must do the work. Forgiveness in our family did not become a rush to restore the status quo. It became an apprenticeship in humility. Sterling apprenticed. He learned to be useful without expecting credit. He let Veda set the temple of their relationship, and that was the only kind of reconciliation that counted. As for me, I learned that papers and signatures matter, that the law can be an instrument of mercy if you know how to use it, and that love without boundaries can be a slow, cruel thing. I learned to read a diary the way a detective reads an affidavit. I learned to make small legal moves that can prevent a catastrophe.
People often ask whether I feel like I stole my son's life. The honest answer is no. I took a responsibility that law allowed in order to protect a life that was in immediate danger. The cost was heavy for everyone, Veda, Sterling, me. But the alternative was heavier still. I do not celebrate Sterling's fall. I lament it. I do not relish his humiliation. I wish for his repair. But I will not let sentimentality keep a person near that will do harm. If you are sitting at home and you hear yourself asking whether to step in or let it be, ask yourself one thing. Who will be hurt tomorrow if you remain silent today? That's the question that should shape your action. Do not confuse kindness for license. Be careful. Be legal. Be brave. Sometimes people will tell you the law is cold. It's not. It's composed of human minds trying to make raw life legible and safe.
If you have to use it, learn its language. Use it to protect, not to punish. Make your interventions that small moral architecture that a fragile life can lean on. Vada is working now, steady and slow. She and Sterling have, in time, built a new sort of relationship, one with walls and a gate and scheduled visits. It's imperfect. It will remain imperfect as long as we are all human. But she sleeps without the terror of waking to empty bottles and half-heard apologies. She eats with friends who bring bowls of soup and gentle nonsense. She laughs some days at a way a child mispronounces a word, and the sound reaches the small places inside our family that had been brittle. I do not tell you this for approval. I tell you because this work is the kind that is often private and necessary. Paper and persistence saved a life in our household. It is not a glamorous hero tale. It is a ledger of receipts, signatures, and stubbornness. So when I said in that corridor, loud enough for the word to hang like a bell, murder, I meant it in the sense that the slow death of neglect is murder by another name. I meant it to wake people up. I meant it to call attention to a pattern. And when I said, I am the heir, I meant the kind of heir who inherits the duty of care. I took on a role that asked me to steward a life toward healing. I imagine some of you are thinking, as you watch or as you read, about the people in your own life, the ones who need help and the ones whose habits make help complicated. If you are, ask for guidance. Talk to an attorney, a social worker, a priest, a counselor. Build your case, collect your receipts, and never underestimate the power of a plain written note from someone who cannot speak. It can be a map of their will. This is not a story with an immaculate ending. People do not become whole in a courtroom, or because of a deed, or because of a single scream. They become whole in repetition, daily therapy, steady paychecks, the slow replacement of harmful patterns with helpful ones. If there's anything I'm proud of, it's that I stopped enabling and started protecting. That is a kind of love that does not feel sweet all the time. It feels like work. It is worth it. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have done the same? Drop your city in the comments so I know where you are listening from, and tell me about the hardest boundary you've had to draw. If this story moved you, consider leaving a small support. Super thanks if your platform allows it, so I can keep telling these stories. These voices need to be heard. There are many stories left to tell, about the DA's decisions, about Sterling's slow rehabilitation, about the small courtroom dramas of family law. But the central thing I want you to hold is plain. Protecting a person sometimes requires you to put your child in a path of consequence. It is not easy. It is not tidy. It is sometimes the best version of love we can give. And as for Vada,
She shelved a book the other day and handed it to a child who asked for it with a grin that reminded me of how simple joy can be when it is not being rationed. She looked up at me, eyes bright, and mouthed, "Thank you." I nodded, because often gratitude is a small, adequate temple. That is where this story rests now, in small, steady healing, in signed papers that keep vultures away, in a son who is learning to be useful, and in a woman who learned to ask and was finally answered. If you've been with me this far, if you felt the tightness in your chest at the same places I did, subscribe for more stories like this. Tell me your line between love and enabling. I will be reading.
We did not make miracles. We made care. And in the end, care is what keeps people alive.